All right. Do we have Christy?
Yes, sir.
Joe, you there? He's back there somewhere.
I see him.
He's logged in. Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to record this conversation. In fact, this conversation is already being recorded. So anything you say can and may very well be used against you in some court of law. So just be very careful about what you say at this point because it is being recorded. I'm recording this for Leo and for Mark, who cannot be here. And this was primarily for Leo. So welcome, Joe. So, as I was saying, Joe, this is already being recorded so that Leo and Mark can watch this. But what I wanted to do was just take a few minutes because Leo asked the question earlier today. There's a lot of stuff going on in regard to our API. I mean, you guys are hearing more and more about it. I'm being asked more and more to explain what's going on with the API. And I will start this out by saying that I believe everybody listening to this is a super awesome expert at APIs. So I'm going to sort of speak to the person that's not on the phone, but I'm going to go to some really basic dumb levels so that if somehow it helps any of you better understand this, which again, I know that's not you, you will have been covered. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right. So, and really, I'm speaking way below Mike Singleton because he develops in this stuff, but he can certainly assess my ability to explain this to the average user because I want all of you to know what our API is, how it works, what does the thing do, so that I'm not always the one that has to be on the conversation explaining this is how the API works. It's something all of you should be familiar with. Okay, so let's start out with, I just want to quickly give you an example of what an API sort of looks like when you're not doing it via a computer. So this is a really dumb example, I'll admit that, but I'm on the Kentucky Secretary of State website. All right. So, sort of what an API looks like to a standard user is you go to a website link, and then here's the website link to do a business search on the state of Kentucky's Secretary of State website. So, when I go to that link to that website, I manually. What's that?
Are we supposed to be looking at your screen?
Oh, yes. Am I not showing my screen? Okay. Yeah, let's do that.
There we go.
Hey.
Okay, so, all right. So, going back, I'm on the Kentucky Secretary of State website. You can see here is the URL up at the top. So, I'm going into the box and I type in Tracker Products and hit submit, and it comes back with a boatload of information about Tracker Products. Now, because I'm a user manually typing this in, I would look at that and say, oh, okay, yes, here's the information that I need. And it just so happened to be the other day I had to do this, where to get onto Azure or something, somebody's asking one thing of somebody else. And in the end, they wanted to know if my business name legally had a comma in it. And I'm like, what the heck does it matter if there's a comma in my business name? But for whatever reason, they're like, listen, we got to know exactly or all the hell's going to break loose. And so I had to come to the Kentucky Secretary website. I did a screenshot of this and sent it back and said, here, this is what the state has registered. Okay. Now, in the world of an API, a computer is doing this. And so a computer would do this on the back end. So here's what it looks like more when a computer is doing it. All right. So here is a little program that I'm running on my computer. It's called Postman. It's a Google Chrome plugin, and it sort of is the same way. And so what I'm doing is here is the URL up at the top. I'm basically saying I want to go to that URL with that information. These 6 lines down below it are all sorts of information that is required to hit our API. Okay, so our API is not as wide open as the Secretary of State's the website here. You noticed when I went here and typed in Tracker Products, it didn't ask me for a username, a password, any sort of coding. It just simply said, type in what you're looking for, hit continue, it let me run. But our API is not that way, of course. We don't want to just let anybody and their brother hit the API and start searching for data. So one of the things that we do require when you hit our API is to provide an authentication key. Now, look at that authentication key right there. There's no way you guys could visually look at that and memorize that. But that is essentially the username and password. In a minute, we'll get to where does all that come from. But in order to hit this API endpoint right here up at the top, and this is one of many API endpoints that we have, and I'll get into that in a little bit. In order to hit that endpoint, I have to provide these 6 pieces of data. If any one of them are not there, or if it's invalid, as a matter of fact, let's go in and I'm going to put in just a letter DD at the beginning of that. So now I have put in an invalid. If I go in and hit send, the API is going to come back and say, hey, authorization's been denied for the request. All right. So now I'm going to go back and say, all right, here's the valid token, resend this request. And now what I get back is something that looks a lot like the Kentucky Secretary of website, but it's in computer code. This is called JSON data, JSON. All right. And so now what happens is when a computer hits that API endpoint, provides all those pieces of data, it comes back and says, based on this, I'm now going to give you all this information on an item. And so now the person that is receiving all this data, which happens to be the computer, they can now say, hey, I'm interested in this. I'm interested in this and whatever else. And there's tons of data in this request that they're not going to be interested. But we throw the kitchen sink at them, and then they can pick and choose what they want. So to get just a little bit more detailed, let me explain what this API endpoint is up here at the top. Every item that is entered into an organization has an org ID number. So if I were to go in, I believe at this point, this is the very last item that was ever entered in this organization, which was Tracker Products Maine. The very last item entered wound up getting the org ID of 150495. Well, notice up here, I'm saying I want to hit this API endpoint and I want to give it this ID. This specific API endpoint was designed so that the person developing it can say, I want to look for that ID number. If I get a response, I'm going to grab the data, and then we're going to go to the next ID number. And so now they can sit here and look and see, well, is there an item for this? Yep, there is. So that obviously was not the last item. Let's go 9.7. There's one for that. Let's go 9.8. And eventually, so now I'm not getting a response. So we know that the very last item entered into this organization was this here. So now what the programmer can do is say, all right, I've got the last item entered. Let's stop now. I'm going to record that that was the last item. And then when I come back in 1 hour, I'm going to look for 9.8. And if I find a 9.8, I'm going to record that data. And then I'm going to go to 9.9 and so on until I get to a point that there's no response. And maybe they do that every hour. And let's say at midnight they get a response, and then at 1 a.m. they don't. They may come back at 1 a.m. and most likely they won't get a response. And they're going to keep iterating through that until they get the next number, and then they keep moving on. What that allows one of our vendors to do is to look for any new item being entered into our product, record the data in whatever system they want to record it into, and then move on with life. That is the primary endpoint that our clients are hitting. So let me stop and take a breath here for just a moment. First of all, does this make a little bit of sense to everybody what I'm doing in the API here?
Mm-hmm. Ben, what data does it return regarding that org ID?
It doesn't return any data on the org ID. What do you mean by that?
So you put in 150495 and it returns all this data down here at the bottom, correct?
That's for an item. That ID number right there there's the item data at the bottom. We return everything we have on the item.
That's what I was asking.
Like I said that earlier, we throw the kitchen sink at them. They determine what they want.
So if they only wanted to pull the recovered by, how does that work?
Well, so what they're going to do is they're going to hit that API. They're going to put in the next number. They're going to provide all this authentication information. And then they're simply going to go down and find recovered by, and there it is. And so they'll know in computer terms, I'm always looking for quote, recovered by, end quote, and then there's the value. So every one of these rows is something different with a value behind it.
Perfect.
And so that's why in the end, we sit down. So Leo is talking to somebody in Colorado right now, and they want to be able to grab data that is entered by the officer and bring it back. And this is exactly how I would explain to them to do it. Hit that API, start with item number 1, because we know the first number 1 up here at the top is going to be the first item entered into an org, and then moving on. Now, hey, Rob, by the way, this is where go to that other example the other day where we flipped all the org ID numbers around for them. They cannot start at org ID number 1. Or actually, they could because I believe there was an org ID number 1. But because we did all that stupid, heinous stuff for them to switch the org ID numbers, now they're going to have gaps in all those numbers.
Yes.
Because with this, there is an expectation that you're going to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so on up. And, so, I mean, you can always tell them, hey, listen, go grab all your data and then start at this org number because it will increment. This is the perfect reason to have an org ID number because now they can have an expectation that I can look for every item in the system.
How does the API work when we are actually taking data from an RMS system into our system?
Well, so what's happening in that scenario is, so let's go back. So I've got a document here that I want to pop up here. Oh, not this one. Sorry, not that one. Here. So here is our web API instruction document. So this document essentially explains what I just explained to you verbally. I mean, you can see, look, here's how we go through. It explains you're going to hit the API. Here's what the API response looks like. Here's what an API response looks like when there is no response, and we go on and on and on. And then we get in there to tell them, okay, listen, in order to start providing the authentication, you need to go into your system and get some information. Like, for example, under every organization, if you go into offices, they can see here's what my office ID is and my org ID. So, so if this is not Ben Townsend Tracker HQ main, this is where I'm going to change the org ID and then the office ID, and we get that from within settings offices. That's one piece of data. The next one is going into user admin. So let's bring up the account that I'm logging in with. Here is my Yahoo account. When I edit this, down at the very bottom, this token, that's the token that I put in right here. So if I wanted, so let's go out of here and let's go into this one right here. I'm going to edit this. If I wanted this user to hit the API, I just click generate a token. Now I can copy it, go back to the thing here, put it in, and now when I hit the API, that's the user that I'm going to use. Now, just as an FYI, anybody hitting the API, they have to be an org admin. So I may have to go in and set the permissions and make this user an org admin. Have to be an org admin to hit the API. That's number one. And number two, you may have to go into license allocations, find that user and say, yes, I want to allocate a license to that user. Here is actually that question. See where it says static token? If I don't have a if I don't have a license dedicated to that user, I would make that false. But because I do in this instance, I'm going to make that true.
Now, here's the issue that I understand with this is if you have that set to if you take that the token from a user, every transaction that the API uses is going to be against that user, correct?
No doubt about it, and that is explained in that user manual that any transaction you make via the API, it's based on the account that you're using to hit the API. And so that's why in the end, what we suggest that everybody do is they go in, create an account called API upload or whatever you want to call it. There is no good way. I mean, let me rephrase that. It would be a disaster to attempt to program the API to upload data on behalf of a user, because that means they're going to have to program an API code for every user in the system. And then, oh, by the way, what happens if that user's already logged into the interface and adding data? Now you're trying to log them in on the back end. It's going to pop up an error and say, hey, this user's already logged in somewhere else. Do you want to log them out? And that's why in the end, what they have to understand, if you're using the API to upload data, here's a perfect example. That group in Colorado that Leo's talking to, they want to have their officers continue to enter evidence into their RMS, and then they want to inject the data via the API, which can be done. Now, I will say it's a different API link that you're hitting. You're not going to hit this sequential org ID link. You would hit another one called like add case and add item. And they could do it that way. But the thing I told Leo is you got to be able to explain them the downfalls of doing that. And the primary downfall is it's no longer the officer entering the item into the system. It's the API uploader account that's entering the item. And now that's what your chain of custody is going to show. And, in the end, I think one of the primary reasons somebody buys a product like ours is so that they can say, there is the answer for chain of custody. It's not in 8 different systems. That's the product that has chain of custody. And so if they circumvent the process for entering evidence, it's going to create problems. So Leo said, well, they're open to discussion. And I said, the answer is then have the officer enter the evidence into the tracker safe interface and then draw it back to the RMS via this process right here, because now you get who recovered the item, who submitted the item, Ben Townsend, not the API uploader. Okay, so long answer, Joe, but that was a good thing to bring up because people need to understand how that works. Okay, so does it make sense to everybody that I allocated a license? Why am I allocating the license? So, that's going to be the number one question that's going to come up is, why do I have to allocate a license to it? Because if you don't allocate a license to it, when your API goes to hit the interface, if there's not a license available, it will respond to the API, hey, sorry, no licenses are available, come back at a later date and time. And I tell people, if all you're doing is hitting the API at 1 a.m., you're in good shape. But if you're hitting it every 5 minutes all day long, you need a license dedicated so that every time you hit it, there's a response. And that goes back to the whole problem with John at Putnam County, that email that I sent out to him. He's like, wait a minute, you told me at a later date and time, now I got to buy a license. No, I didn't. I didn't tell you have to buy a license. I told you that because you only have 2 concurrent licenses and you guys are pounding the system at a pretty great degree, if you're going to use this API interface, which is our online file premise server, you better have a license pegged to it or it's going to respond because you're going to be hitting that all day long. Every time a user drops a file onto the system or tries to read a media file, it's going to hit that API and it's going to say no license is available. So he sort of has his facts wrong because I didn't tell him he had to buy a license. I just told him it would probably be advisable, but you do not have to. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
Right. And he still doesn't have to. It's just he's going to have problems because there's not enough licenses for the amount of use that they need.
That's correct. And even if he's unhappy about it, in the end, I tell everybody and their brother, the way we make more money is to give you more features, to give you more reason to have people logged in. And so he's arguing against the one thing, which is the way we make money. I didn't charge him for the feature, so it's in the end, I understand he's unhappy about it. He may not have understood that to begin with, but in the end, the licensing is how we make money. I'm sorry, dude. So and every client's going to come back and say that they think it's a bad way that we're going about doing what we're doing. And in the end, I guess my question would be, would you be happier if I charged you $75,000 for that feature? Would that be a better answer? So, okay. The last thing I want to throw out here, and then we'll certainly answer more questions if you want. There are literally hundreds of different API endpoints in our product. Okay, so as you get down toward the bottom of this document, I give them some examples of some other API endpoints that they could hit and the way they could use it and the type of data that will come back. So so Joe, what we were talking about a minute ago, I don't know if Joe brought it up, but what if somebody said, I want to post cases to your system? That's a legitimate thing that we want the RMS system to inject into our product. There is the API endpoint, and there is the data that is required to inject data into our API. So I'm telling you, using this Postman product, if you wanted to test this, you could literally take this guide, you could copy that API endpoint into this right here. And I'm not going to do this, but if we posted this in here and you filled out all of these different keys to have all of that data, and then under the value, you put what you're trying to inject, as long as it would work when you hit post over here. So we want to post that data. When you hit send, it would literally write that data in the API into the product, and then you could log into the interface and see it. Now, I don't expect anybody to get crazy enough to hang up and get Postman and figure out how to do that, but you could use this Postman to operate the entirety of our product. You wouldn't want to do that, but you could do that. Because the other thing to keep in mind with this API, the way this sort of works from a very technical standpoint, when a user goes to our website, secure.trackerproducts.com, I don't know if you know this happens, but it actually goes out to Amazon and it downloads to their local machine the entirety of our web product. So the entire user interface, all of these buttons and all of these colors and all the format and layout is actually stored on every individual computer. And then from there, that code interacts with the same API that you interact with via Postman. So that's what's happening is everything that a user does on the interface, they don't look at it and say, oh yeah, hey, all this code is on my local computer. But that's how it works. They run it from the local computer. Every transaction, everything they do is passing one of those API keys to some degree. It works like that. And then they're interacting with the API just like the Postman would. Okay, there's a solid overview of how the API works within our product. I guess the other thing to throw out is this document, this web API document, is 6 pages long. It does not contain every API option there is. I will say we've got to get that built over time because that Concilio contact we're working with in Houston, their guys are developing stuff to work with our interface, and Sergey has been going back to them and he's given them over a dozen different API interactions and he's explained to them how to do it. If our document contained all of that, they'd have been able to just do it all on their own. So I'm telling you, the smarter the client is and the bigger they are, the more likely they are to pound away at that API interface. Okay, let me stop. Any last questions before we wrap this up?
Can I get that document, Ben?
Sure. Yeah, I'll send that out to everyone.
Thanks.
Is that the same document that's on Drive?
It very well could be, yes. But I will say that I know this document on my desktop because I've been the one keeping it is the most current version of it. So for right now, I'll go ahead. I'll even give you the Word doc of that.
Can you put that on Drive so when we go to send it out, we're sending out the right copy?
Yeah. Yes, I don't have any problems doing that.
We might need to resend that Christy to Leo's contact.
I did send that to Leo, who forwarded it off to him, so I'm fairly certain he's got that. I mean, I have not updated it in 6 or 7 months, so most likely whatever's floating around out there is the most current version.
Okay.
Okay, so you guys, while I don't expect you to wheel and deal in a conversation with somebody on API, this should help you guys out a ton to be more knowledgeable on what this API is and how it works and you know, maybe you got to listen to a couple of conversations I have with people, but I'm basically stating the same thing over and over to people. It's once you see how this works and once you have the conversation one time, it's not rocket science. Now, what is the harder part is when they come back and say, okay, this isn't working or I can't do this. But that's when I kick it off to Mike or Sergey anyways. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.